Okay, this is part two of the book review of the book called The German Genius by Peter Watson. Big, giant book. We're going to be talking about Romanticism, sort of coming into the end of the 1700s, the beginning of the 1800s. And a big part of it was, for example, 1776 in the USA. Here is Washington crossing the Delaware. And this inspired hope to people all over Europe that potentially they could be free from a king. And of course it stirred up excitement in France, but France went in a very different direction. But I'm showing you this because to set the tone of what was going through the minds of people in Europe in the late 1700s. There was also a transition out of a phase that's been called neoclassicism. And this guy right here, Jacques-Louis David, was like the greatest artist of the neoclassicist style. And you see it's magnificent, it's precise, detailed, realistic. And neoclassicism most often would look back to the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. But it also, but it also looked back a little bit to the Middle Ages. Not that much, but a little bit. For example, you see Bonaparte's name carved in the rocks as Bonaparte crosses the Alps. But you can also see Carolus Magnus, which means Charles the Great, Charlemagne. Okay, and Napoleon saw himself as the new Holy Roman Emperor. Just like Charlemagne had wanted himself crowned Roman Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, to be in continuity with Rome. Now Napoleon saw himself in line with that. Napoleon wanted to be kind of like Alexander the Great. That's why he went on that big expedition into Egypt, where they found the Rosetta Stone, and he had all these scholars with him, the savants, translating the languages and studying the area. So Napoleon was actually trying to go through Egypt and to go to India and be the big next Alexander the Great. Okay, just like that line of the great conquering generals from Alexander the Great to Julius Caesar, to Charlemagne, and then to Napoleon. He saw himself as a continuity in that line. Okay. And then in contrast, this would be more like of a Romanticism type of piece of art from France. This is by Eugene Delacroix. This is Liberty Leading the People. So Romanticism in France largely came out of the failure of the disaster from 1789 to 1794, where 50,000 heads ended up on the ground, because the French Rev was not like the American. The American was for freedom, republicanism. Okay, it was very, very, very Christian. Okay, versus the French was atheistic. It was like really the forerunner of the communist Soviet revolution in 1917. Okay, it was a disaster. It was an evil mess. And Ann Coulter wrote a great book about it, contrasting what happened in France versus what had happened in USA in those respective conflicts. Now, this is to give you a sense of where Germany was at. It was still divided up into separate city-states, and this guy, Friedrich the Great, was sort of the overall king of Prussia. He was a major Francophile. He only spoke French at his court. Voltaire had visited him, and he never heard a word that wasn't French. Okay, and they love French culture, French books. He's trying to play the flute. He's a little bit of a Nero, trying to be an artist as well as a statesman running the place. But that just gives you a sense. He thought that Germany was backward, and he'd like to see Germany develop, but he wasn't that optimistic. Okay. All right, and also to give you, so the Romanticism, in France came out of a response to what had happened in the 1789 to 1794. In England, it was more like a response to the Industrial Revolution. And this was one of the big stars of Romanticism in England. This is Lord Byron. He's a very good-looking guy, and he was a genius. He was a genius of poetry. He'd write these long, poetic, narrative poems, almost like epics, and Don Juan, for example. But he's also sort of very vulgar and getting himself into a lot of mischief. And he was hanging around with Percy Bysshe Shelley. And Percy Bysshe Shelley was an atheist jerk. The more you learn about Shelley, the less you will like him. He's got a little bit of going on with poetry, but Byron was much better. Goethe just loved Byron, just was in awe of him. Byron was a poetic genius, okay? he was crazy, but he was brave. I mean, he kind of reminds me of Hemingway. I like the fact that he was brave and he did a lot of good things. He tried to help the Greeks, and he's always getting himself into adventurous mischief. Here's Byron visiting an Armenian Catholic monastery in Venice. Okay, this painting was actually by Ivan Ivazovsky, the Russian artist. Okay, but Byron had all these adventures, going to help the Greeks, fight against the Muslims. He was into all kinds of things, constantly having adventures and mischief. Okay, if you read his poems, you'd be surprised how good they are. All right, all of that. Now we finally get to Germany and what was going on over there. So Goethe was sort of the big celebrity, one of the heroes of the German Romantic movement, if you will. And when he was a young guy, good-looking guy, he fell in love with a girl. She rejected him, and he ended up writing a book about it. It was called The Sorrows of Young Werther. And then also, he combined in the love stories from his friends with their ladies. And it became super popular. It was a bestseller all over Europe, made him famous overnight. And then he got a job in Weimar because the Duke over there just loved him and made him like the head administrative guy to run the place. And he actually, with Schiller, started a very nice theater there. And he was a big proponent of culture. Goethe was a genius. He's not only doing his statesmanship, he was also doing his science, trying to study optics, trying to prove that Newton was wrong, but Newton was a lot smarter than him in science. He went to Italy when he was in his, right around 40 years of age, and he studied all this stuff, and he was a major Hellenophile. He loved everything Greek. He had statues of Greek stuff all over his house. And so I like Goethe for being a genius who really knew a lot about the ancient Greeks. And that was all good. And he did have a wonderful theater. He argued a bit with Schiller, but Goethe did some good things. But where Germany falls apart is Immanuel Kant is the scum of the earth. And they put him up on a pedestal as their greatest philosopher. He's a piece of crap. He's worse than Hegel. Okay, those guys are both jerks. Okay, and later on, Nietzsche was another total jerk. Okay, Schopenhauer was at least an open-minded genius, even though he was crazy too. So these guys, in my opinion, kind of led Germany down, and then the Marshall military politician type sort of took over Germany and further destroyed the place. Okay. Here's a quote by, when he started to notice the craziness, like a Shelley and some of these other people in the Romanticism. So Romanticism, as Jaques Barzun says in his book, From Dawn to Decadence, it's basically saying that it's a rejection of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was sort of saying, all we need is reason. Man can reason his way through anything. They're like, no. Your emotions are important. Your heart is important. Goethe wrote, Romanticism is sickness. Classicism is health. And he even thought of his own book. Werther actually bumped himself off after Charlotte had rejected him. And the point Goethe was making is that Werther was an idiot. But a lot of people did copycats of that. So that's another example of Romanticism being crazy. And Percy Bysshe Shelley was totally crazy. Byron was only half crazy. He sort of reminds me, like I said, of Ernest Hemingway of his time, but I like Ernest Hemingway a lot better even than Byron. Ernest Hemingway was a really heroic guy, but he would be sort of like the romantic equivalent of Byron for the 1900s. Okay. Now here's an example of Romanticism in painting in Germany. This is Caspar David Friedrich, The Three Ages of Life. Okay. And he was really an extraordinary painter. In fact, the architect, Schinkel, had seen his paintings, this one in particular, Wanderer Above the Sea Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. It's called a Rückenführer, whereby you look at it from the back and you feel as if you're in the painting. And to me, it reminds me of the idea of trying to study a subject from all the different views, like 5-6 blind men and an elephant, till you come above all that and you have like a bird's eye view looking down so you can see things objectively. But, it's a beautiful painting, and it's also the idea, too, of man against nature. And nature's just so overwhelming and extraordinary compared to man, just this little animal on this big earth. Another famous painting of Caspar David Friedrich. I'm going to show all these paintings first, then we'll start talking more about what's in the book and stuff, just to set the tone with the paintings. This is another Caspar David Friedrich's Christ on the Mountains, and it was a very unusual thing to do in those days, to combine a religious painting like of Christ, which is considered the highest possible expression in art, with a landscape, which was at that time considered the lowest possible expression. So people would give Caspar David Friedrich a hard time, but he didn't care. He was an intense Lutheran guy. This is Clearing Up After the Storm in Sicily by Andreas Achenbach. Okay, and this is a German painter, and this is a reminiscent of that idea of Romanticism in Germany. Kind of came early, like about 1765 to, I don't know, around 1790 or so, and it sort of reminds one of this idea. It was called Sturm Drang, storm and stress, and this is sort of the storm starting to break off the coast of Sicily. So, it's a beautiful painting. Very much reminds me of Ivan Avajovsky's painting, The Ninth Wave, Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit more out of the book. That was all just to sort of set the tone, because, there was always a competition between Germany and France and England, and later on USA got involved. So, the Germans felt inferior. They look over at France, and France is this more established, sophisticated place compared to them. And England was up and coming. For example, Goethe read the plays of Shakespeare, and he was in awe. They were amazing, the plays of Shakespeare. So they wanted to have their own literature. And Goethe and Schiller, developing the theater at Renaissance. Peter Watson is claiming that this was for Germany, the German Renaissance, where they started. I don't know if it was a Renaissance, if they never had anything before it, but it was the German golden age, if you will, in the development of culture. And I actually think Schiller was better than Goethe in terms of his anchoring and his moral position, that Goethe, in my opinion, sort of let the German people down. Okay, he's a big hero in Germany, but look, a genius like Goethe, he can think whatever he wants. He can, dissent on whatever he wants with regard to Lutheranism, etc. But regular people can't. And if you don't have a coherent value set for people to be unified around, to respect, Goethe was sort of turned into a degenerate. What is Faust, writing about making a deal with the devil, and then he's just chasing around young women? I kind of lost a lot of respect for Goethe the more I started to study him. Okay, Bildung is a word that means to build oneself, to develop one in terms of moral character, education, and skills. And that was a big thing for the Germans. How do we build ourselves up? Okay, and I liked the idea of individualism, self-development. I think that's a good thing. But they went too strong on it, in my opinion, sort of the neoclassicism reliance on the ancient Greeks and Romans, like Joachim Winckelmann. I talked about him in that last lecture. He's that homosexual German guy who went into some of the archaeological digs and wrote all these wonderful things about how great the ancient Greeks were in their statues. But you can learn something from the ancient Greeks, but the ancient Greeks, they don't have Christianity. They're much more brutal than is widely realized today. They certainly developed thinking, the development of the human mind, that was beautiful. Almost all of our words about metacognition, thinking about thinking, come from the ancient Greeks. Stoicism, Epicureanism, empiricism, analysis, Socratic dialogue, all of that comes from them. All right, so anyways, this though was a big concept, and that was really Goethe's whole focus is around that. Like his Wilhelm Meister book was all about how does one develop the self as an individual. Okay, we talked about how they felt inferior to the French. One nice thing Germany had going for it was that because of the different city-states, it was hard for anybody to censor things, and the people really liked to read a lot, and they made a lot of libraries by the mid-1700s where people could loan books, so their literacy rates were very high in Germany. Okay. Also, Beethoven is a big transitional figure in some ways, from neoclassical style to romantic style, and Beethoven was off the charts magnificent. Some say his Ninth Symphony, though, was a confession that instrumental music alone doesn't go far enough. As in the last movement of the Ninth Symphony, it breaks out in words and singing, the Ode to Joy. And people claim that music has to do that. Wagner would claim that that was necessary, and a confession by Beethoven that verbal music with singing is superior to instrumental alone. So anyways, Kant said instrumental music alone is like wallpaper, and it's not really culture. Kant is the biggest jerk. The more you learn about Immanuel Kant, the more you'll hate him, and rightfully so. Ayn Rand said he was the most evil man who ever lived. Yet a lot of people liked him. Schopenhauer liked him. You should hate him, okay? Nietzsche was at least smart enough to even though he initially liked him, to grow to hate him because Kant's the worst, man. Okay, other great composers. We didn't even talk about them last time. I mentioned a bunch of the other ones. Of course, they are the greatest classical music composers of any country ever by far. But Johann Pachelbel had a magnificent, it's called Pachelbel's Canon. I'll put a link in it. It's Canon in D. It's beautiful. It's a magnificent piece. I used to listen to it all the time. I still love it, okay? Telemann was good too. Telemann's sort of this Baroque style that's very pleasant. I used to study a lot listening to that, okay? Pachelbel is great for being with your woman. It's one of the best songs for being with your woman. Trust me. Okay, and Germany was proud of their composers because they were finally better at something than the other big countries in Europe. They were, they were better than the Italians because the Italians had kicked their butt like an opera. That's why Mozart was so eager to have an opera in German, like in the movie Amadeus. Let's see, and also, the papacy had previously sponsored a lot of the great musicians. So Rome was a center of culture, of music and painting and whatnot. And this author, Watson, claiming that the 1700s and late 1700s in Germany was their Renaissance, or their golden age, if you will. It reminded me of Arthur Herman when he wrote a book about the Scots. He claimed the late 1700s were the Scotland's Renaissance. But again, I don't like the term Renaissance because they never had a previous high point, so I just call it their golden age. Okay, and I hate the word Enlightenment because Enlightenment's a joke of a word. It's just scumbags like Voltaire and Gibbons and Diderot claiming they were superior to the Middle Ages because they use reason and they lighten the people of awareness like they're coming out of Plato's cave. But it's actually kind of the opposite. They're going into atheism, and that's going to lead to slavery and destruction. Okay, it's not enlightenment. In the Middle Ages, they call it the Dark Ages. The Middle Ages did a lot of useful stuff, and the great scientific discoveries were mostly made by very devout Christians. People like Isaac Newton, James Clerk Maxwell. Okay, people like that. The great music, Johann Sebastian Bach, George Friedrich Handel. Okay, people that are very religious, not these scumbags like Voltaire, Gibbons, and Diderot and Rousseau. All these dirtbags who don't do any science. Okay, so anyways, we talked about Romanticism in Germany. We talked about in England it was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. And later along, some really great men came out of England, like John Ruskin and Charles Dickens, And they speaking up for the plight of the poor man, which was good. William Wordsworth said that poetry should begin with spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So that's a very Romanticism type thing to say, to emphasize the emotion. Okay, but you still need Christianity. If you get away from that, you turn into a maniac. Like Shelley and Byron were sort of insane, and they were related to the early founders of feminism, which comes out of Satanism. It's evil. Okay, let's see. All right, well, anyways, I'm sort of setting the tone. We're going to go into a bunch of other stuff, and that's a little bit of an idea of the comparison of Romanticism in Germany, Sturm Drang, versus in England in response to the Industrial Rev, and in France in response to their Rev. I hope you found that helpful.